You guys, so this is cool. I've never actually sat in a DAA meeting. I'm in love with the big book. Again, my name's Matt, and I'm an addict. I'm in love with this book, man, and what saved my life, in this literature. So to be sitting in this meeting is really cool. I fully identify as an addict. I had my first drug-induced seizure at 13, been using every substance that I could get my hands on, for a very long time just to change the way I feel. So I just identified, with the solution laid out in this book. It's what finally worked for me this time. Really quick, I'll qualify with this, that, I spent a lot of years. The first time I ever identified with somebody, like, feeling the way I felt was in a meeting 23 years ago now. I walked into an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, thought I had hit bottom. I had just gotten my second DUI, and I thought that's what, my bottom would be. I lost my license for 10 years, and I just have an amazing capacity to continue lowering the bar. I just finally, got sober 5 years ago, coming up on 5 years in November. And, this was, it's cool to be able to share and go over a little bit about this fourth step, because this is really where the one thing that I had never tried until, 4.5 years ago. And when I came in this time, I'm fully convinced, I'll start basically, at step one. I'm fully convinced that until I fully concede to my innermost self, until I really have that first step experience, I'm never going to get to an inventory. You know what I mean? There's just no reason for me to really get to this point of doing an inventory and, really doing this searching and seeking that I need to do. I will never see the purpose in it. And that was my experience for 18 years, in and out of the rooms. I would come in and I would say I'm doing step work. I would sit down and make people happy by reading 1, 2, and 3, and even got on my knees a couple times and did a third step prayer with people. But I had no idea what was the purpose of, doing this inventory. How was that going to, I just use drugs too much. You know what I mean? I just enjoy putting a needle in my arm. That's just how I felt. You know what I mean? I had no idea, even after 18 years of coming in and listening to this stuff, how doing an inventory was ever going to help me stay sober. And this time I was so broken, and it's kind of been a revelation of mine over the past few months that, I'm fully convinced that once I had that first step experience, that was when the power of God began to flow in. I just didn't know it yet, but there was something that changed in me. There was a willingness that came from somewhere else other than myself. There was just something that had changed in me, and it just started by me just saying, okay, I surrender, I'm fucked. You know what I mean? And fully conceding to that. And so I had to have that first step experience, in order for me to even get to this point of willingness to even do an inventory. So so that led me to doing this 2 and 3, and then I did this third step prayer with my sponsor, and certainly didn't have a burning bush experience or a white light experience, but something had changed. I was crying for the first time in probably almost 20 years. I was just I don't know where that came from. Something was beginning to just spark inside of me, and and that was it. And I share that because I really had no idea what was going on. I think I had 4 weeks sober at the time. And I did this third step with my sponsor in the back of the back room of an IHOP, and I had no idea what was really. I was so broken that I was just willing to do whatever this guy told me to do. I knew him when we had used together. I knew him in a past life, and he was there was something different about him, and I was just bro, show me what you did. And so I was willing to take these suggestions. And, so we did this third step prayer, and I still remember I went home. I got on my knees again and did this third step prayer again on my own at home. And, and then immediately, you know what I mean? So that the reason I say all this is because the very next words after that third step prayer, there's one paragraph, but then it says next. we launched on the course of vigorous action, and that was my experience. Like, I got into my 4-step very quickly, and I started putting a pen to paper, and I didn't really understand even at that point, how any of this stuff, how was me writing down, what I'm pissed off at everybody about, how was that going to help me stay sober? Again, I just like to drink and use, you know what I mean? Like, I wake up every day with, like, the thought of drinking and using, like, who I'm pissed off at really does, it didn't make any sense to me even still then. And, and the reason was, and it talks about it in here, because just seeing, being able to, see my part in things just wasn't there. Like, as far as the only thing that I could see is, like, what you had done to me, how the world had, everything the world had done wrong to me. That was about as far as I could see it. I wish I could paraphrase what it says in there, but, like, that was really all I could see. It was just everything that other people had done wrong to me. And, and then I just had a bad break, you know what I mean? Yeah, I would just make excuses, I'll leave it at that. Like, my life was all excuses about how you did something to me, and, like, I'm just getting back, or I'm just retaliating, and, like, I had no way of really looking at myself. And that's what this process helped me do. Once I really began, so I mean, we did it as laid out in the book. So in doing a 4-step, and I do it with all my guys now. We make a grudge list. There's all the people that, create this, that when I think about them, that I have this feeling, inside of me that, like, stirs up, right? You know what I mean? And the example that I give to my guys is, like, when you think about this situation, does it create this emotional turmoil inside of you? Or, do you get this like, thought of, like, fuck them? You know what I mean? Like, when I think about somebody and I have this, like, emotional response inside, where, like, you know what I mean? I could care less about what happens to them. Like, I probably have a resentment, and that's how that started for me. It was just writing down a bunch of people that, I was just pissed off at, and so it was really easy for me to do that. You know what I mean? I got a whole list of people in my life, and at that point, so I could do column 1. I could write who I was pissed off about, and it was really easy for me to write why and how you had wronged me, and and so columns 1, 2, and 3 were really easy, but where the rubber really began to meet the road, and where this entire talk tonight and everything that I try and share with you is all just trying to share with you about my my experience with a spiritual awakening. Like, this is what really began to happen with me in this process, was, like, I began to actually see things from a different light, and that's what happened in the 4th column. Like, once I was easy to make these 3 columns on the front of the page, and then, so I did all that, and then my sponsor was like, okay, now that you've done that, flip the page, you know what I mean? And now on the back of that page, I needed to start looking at where I was selfish and self-seeking and dishonest and frightened in these situations. And, like, and I had to start looking at my own behavior, like, what part did I play in these things? And that was eye-opening for me, because, like, again, I had been the victim, in every situation, you know what I mean? That's why I was pissed off at you, because you wronged me, and, you know what I mean? So, like, let me write a full-page essay on how I'm the victim in this situation. And, that's what this 4-step really began to help me see, is that I had a part to play in every situation, and so in that 4th column, it's actually very specific. It doesn't even ask us what our part is. It asks us where were we wrong? What did I do? And it actually says disregarding the other person entirely. It tells us to look at where we were selfish, self-seeking, dishonest, and frightened. And I had to really begin to look at the fact that, like, I was selfish and self-centered in every area of my life. Like, every relationship I had, life was happening to me. Like, everything, I was the victim all the time in every situation. And that's one of the things that, doing this 4-step began to help me do, was iron out these patterns. And the fact that I was a fucking victim in every relationship, in every area of my life, like, I played the victim. And I was using that as an excuse to drink and use. And I began to see how doing this inventory really did begin to identify why I drank and used the way I drank and used, So that's so like those first three columns, they're for me, they were really easy to write. And I see it in a lot of guys, you know what I mean? It's really easy, for us to write those first three columns, but I start to see some hesitancy, and I experienced the same thing in writing that fourth column. And I'll share this with you that so I already told you, I really didn't even fully understand everything. I was just following directions and doing this 4-step. I would just, my sponsor would tell me what to do, and I would go home and do it. But I also did it like kicking and screaming. You know what I mean? I really did not, once I really began to look at my part in things, and I don't know, there was something about this inventory process where like I was just so resistant to it. But again, it's my opinion that like, having had, like I just knew I was fucked in that first step. Like, I'll back up a little bit, but my experience in the year and a half before getting here this time was I got out of prison. I caught another charge. I took that trial. I won at trial. I was facing 35 years in prison. And I won at trial, and then I got out, and then I was getting high like 4 days later. And like, so I just knew, you know what I mean? Like, this was the pattern. I was just gonna die or be in prison the rest of my life. And that was the experience that I had to have to like even get me to the point of willingness where like I was willing to do whatever was suggested in this book. And so that, I had to have that first step experience where I just knew I was screwed. Every other time I'd come in here before, it was just, I had some consequences I wanted to go away, or I just knew that like, you guys were kind of happy and I kind of wanted to be happy. This time I was as willing as the dying could be. You know what I mean? I knew that I was going to die if I didn't do this stuff. And as a result of going through these 4 columns in this resentment inventory, I began to see patterns, like over and over in my life, I had done the same things, like just different people, you know what I mean? I had run through everyone's life and I had just done the same thing over and over and over again. And just, I began to see these patterns, and I began to see why I reacted that way, that like, I'm still holding on to resentments from things that happened to me when I was a little kid, and like, why am I still upset about this stuff, but the reality was deep down inside, that was my excuse to drink and use the way I wanted to use. And these things were hurting. I had never really healed from these things. And I never even really talked about them, until there was a couple of things that I never shared with anybody, until this time, after 18 years, I finally got honest about a couple of things that happened in my childhood, and I don't know, man. Whatever happened in that process of me getting honest for the first time in my life, something began to change in me. You know what I mean? I've been a garbage can addict. I put every single thing I could in my body, to change the way I felt. And like somehow in this process of I wrote this 4-step out, and then doing this 5th step, something began to change in me. And by the time I got up from that 5th step with my sponsor, I don't know, something, I was beginning to have a spiritual experience. You know what I mean? Like this thing that I had heard you guys talk about for so long. But, and the spiritual experience is like, I still wasn't having this like burning bush God moment, but like my thinking was beginning to change, and like my taste in music, you know what I mean? Like, I just, I didn't have to wake up and listen to Master P Ghetto D every day. You know what I mean? Like, I used to love, you know what I mean? There was just certain albums that, like, I used to love listening to. And, like, and, like, when I got here this time, like, I had a Kevin Gates playlist this long. You know what I mean? And then, like, after doing this process, I began to notice that, like, my taste in music was beginning to change. Like, that's the rearrangement of ideas and attitudes they talk about in the NA literature. It's a complete rearrangement of my thinking that it explains in the spiritual experience in here. Like, that's the spiritual experience I was having. My thinking was beginning to change just as a result of taking some suggestions. And again, I probably only had 3 months sober, maybe about 90 days when I did my 5th step. And So I was still out there, bro. I was still shot out. I just came off of, 3 weeks, spending about a $10,000, well, about 4 weeks, about a $10,000 run. And I came in here, I was out of my mind, and so, I share all this because I wasn't all with it, you know what I mean? But I took the suggestions and I just started doing this stuff, and these things began to happen in my life. I want to also back up and share this too, that I did not do this 4-step, perfectly. So when I came in this time in a relationship. I drank and I was using and I was running with, a girl. And then we both went to detox. She went to a different detox. I went to a detox. And then we got sober together, and she got out of detox. She picked me up and we got clean. I went to an NA meeting. It wasn't really for me. And that's how I wound up coming back to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And I share all this because my sponsor told me, you probably shouldn't be in a relationship for the first year. And I was like, okay, I hear you, but, And the second time he came and told me that, I fired him in the middle of my 4-step. He told me you probably shouldn't be in this relationship. And I was just like, I heard you the first time, but, so I fired him in the middle of my 4-step. And I share that because, I want you to understand that it is not a person that kept me sober. It was the willingness that I had in seeking this relationship with this higher power that, there was something that began to change in this process. I took that same 4-step and I got a new sponsor and I brought it to another man and I sat down and did a 5th step with him. And that's when my life began to change. It wasn't that man that kept me sober. Something for the first time got me to a point where I didn't want to drink and use, and that was what was beginning to happen. And I just think it's cool that I have that experience that I just know for a fact in my core that it wasn't any man that kept me sober. There was some kind of power beginning to work in my life as a result of taking some directions. And, so that's my experience with that, that, as long as we follow the directions as for me, what worked as laid out in this book, I can begin to have that rearrangement of my thinking. I don't want to get off too much of a tangent, but so that's the resentment, the benefit that I got out of the resentment inventory was beginning to see patterns and really doing that 4th column. Like I said, I began to really have to identify where I, disregarding the other person entirely, where was I selfish? Where was I self-seeking? Where was I being, dishonest in these situations? And in my sponsorship, line, now we're very big on dishonesty is not just cash register honesty and dishonesty. You know what I mean? Where am I being delusional? Where am I still thinking that life is always happening to me? You know what I mean? Because that's very dishonest. You know what I mean? If I just feel everything that happens to me throughout the day is poor, happening to me, and I get into poor me, and I have a million excuses to get resentful or to be in fear. That's just dishonest. Life is just happening. You know what I mean? And it is. So I have to be. That's just one example, but these delusions that I still can get caught up in and that I can still live in. You know what I mean? That just aren't reality, and that's dishonesty. So, I have to make sure I look at that, because I'm a very big proponent, and that's why it was really cool to be asked to do this 4-step, because I'm a huge believer in, the 12 and 12. It says self-examination, meditation, and prayer. You know what I mean? There's a direct linkage, and it's true. Even today, I did this 4-step. I've done 2 4-steps now. I actually went through all the steps again when I got a new sponsor, another new sponsor. But I'm a very big proponent on continuing to take inventory on a daily basis. And again, in 10 and 11, I'm still looking for the same things. You know what I mean? Where am I being selfish and dishonest, resentful, afraid, in my daily activities? This inventory process that I learned, in doing the 4-step, I have to continue to carry this into my daily life, and I have to get comfortable with doing being disciplined about doing this stuff, in 10 and 11. So, It's really important, you know what I mean? Like once I, begin to understand, you know what I mean, how these things drove me and affected me in that fourth column. And then, so, that's one inventory. If you haven't done a 4-step, there's, we do three inventories, and then also in that fourth column, some people do it differently. Some people do a whole separate inventory for harms. But the way I was taught and the way I do it is in that fourth column, I do identify if I've caused harm to anybody, and then we'll pull our 8th step from that. So there's 3 inventories, and then I moved on to the fear inventory. And again, I'll share my experience, and then I'll also share, what I do with guys now, but my experience in beginning to write this fear inventory was like, I didn't really think I had a lot of fears. It's just like, okay, you know what I mean? Like I can probably say I'm, scared of going back to prison for the rest of my life, or, like I might say I'm scared of snakes, you know what I mean? Like some stupid stuff, but, my sponsor began to ask me some questions, and he's the one that really got me thinking about, all these different things that I really, that just drove me, all this self-centered fear, you know what I mean? That like, I really was just petrified of you not liking me, you know what I mean? Like my entire life was driven by like trying to, say the right thing or do the right thing so that you wouldn't look at me in an unfavorable light. Like I wanted you to like me so bad from the time I was in like 2nd grade. And like, the first time I got pushed down on the playground, you know what I mean? And the kid was making fun of my big buck teeth. Like these are the things that like, it started when I was at a very young age. And he helped me look at that like those were the self-centered fears that they're talking about in here that drove me, my entire life, and I didn't even realize it. I just thought, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I mean, I just thought I wanted to have friends or whatever. But no, like, that's really what it was. I have these instincts and these, and we learn more about that in 6 and 7. But I have these innate needs and, like, these instincts inside of me that, like, I need to get met. And, like, and I want you to like me. I want approval from you. And when I'm not getting that, or if I'm in fear of not getting that, I'm going to say and I'm going to do things. I'm going to lie. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to manipulate. I'm going to do whatever I got to do, because I'm in so much fear, of you not liking me. And again, I'm just using that as an example. But, those are some of the fears that I began to learn about that like, there's such a deeper level to this stuff. A lot of these fears are what drove me in all my behaviors. My sponsor did tell me, I wanted to back up to even on that resentment inventory. So, I'm very clear with all the guys that I work with today, and my sponsor did the same thing with me. He said, we entered into, an agreement, in that 3rd step. I said a 3rd step prayer, and I entered into this thing, with whatever this power is, right? I said this 3rd step prayer, and I said I was turning my will and my life over to this thing. What did that mean? You know what I mean? And for me, like I said, I was shot out. But like what that meant for me, at that point was like I agreed to go through with the rest of the steps. You know what I mean? Like that was the best that I could do. Like obviously God's will for my life, you know what I mean, at that moment in time had me sitting in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and had me, getting into step work. So like obviously his will for me was to continue forward with the rest of the steps. That was the best way I could look at it. So that's all I could do was continue to take suggestions. But, in starting prayer in that 3rd step, my sponsor told me, we're going to continue to pray through this process, even if you feel like it's not working. And I say this to guys all the time, like, I want you to go home and I want you to pray about it. Even if you feel like God's not listening, you're not feeling connected, like, I want you to pray anyway. And that's why, because, like, I am convinced that the power of God is there. You know what I mean? I may be blocked at different periods of time. But, so in this inventory process, there's a prayer in each inventory. I'm not going to go over the specifics, but it's very important, when we sit down and we begin doing these inventories, that we ask God to guide us through this process, and we ask God to help reveal the resentments that, need to be revealed. I ask God to help me remove this fear. I do like the fear prayer. Let me find that and read it. How much time do I got, Tommy?
Like 10.
All right. So this is in the third paragraph in the fear inventory on page 68, but it says, paradoxically, it is the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage, and all men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through us what he can do. And then we ask God to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. And at once we commence to outgrow fear. And that's, that was my experience. I just began praying and and just taking these, the suggestion to pray before I did this stuff. And so, and even still today, you know what I mean? I have fears that pop up all the time on my nightlies, and I have to ask God to help me, outgrow this thing. You know what I mean? Help get me through this fear. Cause right now it's very fucking real. I'll have, you know what I mean? This, and I know deep down inside, I should probably have more faith, you know what I mean? Or I have a million experiences now. I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating, but I have a lot of experiences now since being sober that God has showed up, and that I probably don't need to be in this fear, but right now it feels very real. And I need to ask God to help guide me through that and try and, just do what that prayer says. We ask him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. And I know, what God would have me be is of service to others. You know what I mean? That's what my life has become. I get up and I go to work every day. That pays the bills. But I've really fallen in love with the service, and that's what God would have me be. He would have me stick my hand out to the new guy, every single new person I see at a meeting, or pick up the phone when somebody needs to talk at 2:00 in the morning. That's what God would have me be, and in that prayer. And when I'm doing those things, I'm usually not, because when I'm in fear, I'm just thinking about myself. You know what I mean? Whatever I've got going on. But if I'm doing what God would have me be, as it says in the prayer, I'm usually thinking about somebody else. So of course, I'm not really living in that fear too much. So, I mean, and again, all this takes practice, and talking about the fear inventory. It's easy to read this stuff, and it's easy to say, I'm going to ask God to remove, but I get it that fears, a lot of these fears are what drives us, but so it's easier said than done. But let me see if I want to hit on anything else. I'm trying not to forget anything that I really wanted to talk about. Yeah, let me just read this one paragraph. There's only a few paragraphs on this fear inventory, but we can all, I'm sure, at least with the guidance of a sponsor, probably sit down and write a list of our fears and write our fear inventory. But this is really, the whole purpose of doing this fear inventory. Is the third column of this fear inventory. It says, perhaps there is a better way. We think so. For we are now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We are in the world to play the role He assigns. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us, and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. And it's true, it takes practice, but the more that I can begin to lean on God, and the more I can begin to truly trust, that when these fears come up and when I have this stuff going on, the more I can learn to just trust Him and just turn this thing over to Him, and whatever the results are going to be. Do page 417, if you haven't read 417, but I'm a big believer too that nothing happens in God's world by mistake. I don't know why everything happens. But, I believe that, there are no coincidences. So if I can really begin to trust that stuff, that's when I begin to match, you know what I mean, all this crazy stuff that's going on in my life or in the world, you know, with serenity. You know, and that's what that paragraph's talking about. You know what I mean? Like, I can kind of be at peace with it all. Like, yeah, there's some messed up stuff going on. You know what I mean? And, like, even in my life, you know, for anybody that knows me, this past year was probably the hardest year of my life. You know, I had to, you know, watch my sister slowly die. She had 7 strokes within a matter of months. And one stroke after another, she just got worse and worse. And you know, I was one of her primary caretakers and you know, her power of attorney. And I had to watch all of this slowly over a period of months. And, you know, somehow, you know, I made it through that with, you know, with a little bit of grace and definitely a little bit of serenity. You know what I mean? Because I just knew that, like, it was completely out of my control. You know, and that's what I read in that paragraph, that, like, if I truly just turn this thing over and I begin to trust that, you know, whatever is happening is, you know, that God's got it under control. He really doesn't need my input. That's when I match calamity with serenity, like it's talking about. I can enjoy just a little bit of peace about whatever's going on in the world. And I don't have to agree with it. You know, I don't have to like what's going on around me, but it helps me deal with some of these fears, you know, that I when I have them come up. In a couple more minutes, I guess, you know, and talking about this sex inventory, you know, my sponsor told me when I'm working with guys, I really don't care about your sex life. I really don't. You know, that's not what this sex inventory is all about. I don't care about how many people you've been with. I don't, you know, all we're trying to do in this inventory is iron out, patterns of behavior. You know, and there's 9 questions here. So, you know, yes, we identify, you know, the intimate relationships that we've been in. But, you know, really the entire point of doing this sex inventory. So it says we reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, inconsiderate? Whom did we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, and bitterness? Where were we at fault, and what should we have done instead? We got this down on paper and we looked at it. That's what we're looking for in the sex inventory. You know, I want to see, you know, what were my patterns of behavior in all these, you know, intimate relationships. You know what I mean? Like, you know, was I, and just about every, you know, but was I completely selfish and self-seeking in all of these intimate relationships? Did I use these women, you know what I mean, to meet my every need? You know, and was I just self-will run riot in every relationship? Did I ever even really love any of them? You know, and for me, the answer was no. I was married for 12 fucking years. You know, and it was a relationship, I found out through this inventory process that was a relationship of convenience. You know, we got together because I sold weed and she wanted weed, and before I know it, like, I'm asking her to marry me because I saw her sister get married and she got a bunch of money. You know what I mean? Like, from the wedding. So I was like, whoa. I was like, let's get married. You know what I mean? And, like, that's how I got into a marriage. And, like, you know, and that I began to see that, like, I never even loved, you know, and I stayed together for 12 years. She put up with me for a long time, you know, and so she just couldn't deal with it anymore. And, you know, and that's what I learned as a result of doing this inventory was, you know, just really looking at myself again and how in all areas of my life I was just selfish. And again, when I say self-centered and selfish, and, like, when I got here, I didn't, you know what I mean? I used to think, you know what I mean? I was one of the nicest people I knew. You know what I mean? I would hold the door for the little old ladies, you know what I mean? Like, you know, and like I would, you know, I would probably steal your wallet and then help you look for it. You know what I mean? But like I was, I don't know. And even my family would tell you that, like, I really was a really good person, you know, and I truly felt that way when I got here. I was like, I'm not really that selfish. I just like to get high. And, you know, and that's what this process really began to help me look at was, like, you know what I mean? Every waking moment, you know what I mean? My life revolved around getting high. You know, and every interaction that I had with other people, there was an ulterior motive. If I was being nice to you, it was because I wanted something. Or I at least wanted you to leave me the fuck alone so I could get high the way I wanted to get high. You know what I mean? Like, even my family and stuff. Like, that was the only reason, like, you know, I would be nice to them because, like, I know I might need to ask them for $20 tomorrow. You know what I mean? And then, like, I really just want you to get off my back so that I can do what I want to do. And, like, and I had these ulterior motives in every single interaction in my life. Everything was transactional, you know, and I really had to look at that. You know, and that's what I began to see. That, you know, yeah, I thought I was a good person. But I had to look at the fact that I was self-centered in every moment of every day. You know, every job I had, every relationship I was in, every decision I ever made. You know, the back of my mind was I was checking in the back of my mind, like, how was this going to benefit me? And if it wasn't, I probably wasn't going to do it. And, you know, that's, you know, I began to see the type of person and the way my thinking really was. And that's what this helped me identify. That was where my thinking really began to change, and I began to understand that I really was the problem. So in sticking really on the 4-step, like, that's what this process helped me do. And continuing forward with the rest of the steps is really where I began to, you know, I began to learn how to address that and how to clean up my side of the street. You know what I mean? And, like, really, you know, truly admit to the people around me, like, you know, where I had been wrong. You know what I mean? And truly, and I'll share this and then I'll shut up. In order for me to really, you know, find some humility in the 7-step, like, I have to really be honest in this stuff and really you know, like, really look at myself in this 4th column, or else I'm not really going to find any of these. You know, the book says, do we find these behaviors objectionable? Like, you know, there was a lot of stuff where, like, until I was really honest, you know, with myself in this process, like, you know, I had no humility, you know, by the time I got to the 7th step, you know, with a lot of my behaviors. I didn't really think that they were that wrong, or, you know, I just wanted to stop hurting people, and I wanted my life to stop sucking. But, you know, it was really important for me to go back, you know, after, again, I was really shot out the first time I went through. And that's why I went back through the steps again, you know, with another sponsor a second time, because there was a lot more things that I found in my 4th step the second time that I definitely found objectionable, you know, that I didn't the first time around. I don't know. There's probably a lot that I wanted to say that I probably left out, but I guess I'll probably stop there and open it up, or whatever you guys normally do. So.